what I found in both Japan and Taiwan is very respectful places.
Yes.
There's a real class to the way people are.
Right.
So if that was your experience.
And what's funny, and of course, economically, they're also wonderful, right? You have low tax rates. It's very, very easy to start a business. I had a friend who started an English school, as one does. After about a year of operating, the local tax lady came in, and she had the local police, sergeant sitting with her. And they came in for tea. And she said, so, we know that you've been running this business and you haven't been paying any taxes, but you're a small business and that's completely understandable. But at this point, we estimate based on the traffic that you're probably making about this much. And so we would, hope that you pay, roughly this amount of taxes. That's what we would sort of imagine might happen. But the policeman was there to communicate that it's fine, right? You're a startup. Life is hard for a startup. We completely understand how it is. But now that we can see that your business is doing really well, you do have to do your share, was the signal. And that is so in contrast to what one gets in the US, or I imagine Britain, where it's almost like it's a war between the regulators and the small businesses. Like, can we find a way to shut you down? It's like if you go to the DMV, and you're going to renew and they're like, let me see if I can find some form that you don't have. And, as soon as they, you must go home and get this form, they have defeated you.
I have multiple businesses. It's so hard.
It's incredible.
The range of things, like my most recent one, I bought a bar.
Yes.
A bar, it's open twice a week.
Yeah.
Really. My first difficulty was taking over the bank account from the people who had it. I spent 6 weeks with the bank trying to get it transferred into my name, signing the mandates, taking identity of them, KYC checks, all the registration documents, and a combination of their poor systems and me just being unable to get them to confirm my documents. In the end, I have to give up. I said to them, I'm going to another bank now. I'm going to a neobank, which I created in a day, because you cannot transfer the account to me.
It's astounding.
The licenses we have to have. If I want to do anything within the property, which is a fixed structure, I have to submit a planning application. So one example is we have a garden, and we may want to have a bar in there. If the bar is mobile, it's fine. But if it's a fixed structure, I have to go get planning permission and get approval to do that. I could tell you endless stories, all the different licenses I have to pay for. It's just endless difficulty doing business. It's setting up businesses, it's operating businesses, it's getting banking, it is licenses, and then there's all the taxes we pay. I'm amazed how many businesses are still operational, but I'm also frustrated because I think how many businesses could start and exist and be operational that aren't, because it's just too hard.
Yeah, and you saw Jeremy Clarkson's recent, right? Like the on his farm show, and the entire theme of it was just him going to battle. And this is a guy with significant resources and a significant voice. Mm-hmm. So how is it for normal people? They are absolutely crushed. And that brings us back to the Keynesian thing, where the purpose of the Keynesian system is not to crush small businesses, for sure. Nobody who designed that thought that's what would happen. But when you concentrate all of these resources into the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats have to find something to do. They'll check licenses, right? and so nowhere in there, figures the actual experience of the entrepreneur who is on the business end of all of this. Really, it's just make work to justify budgets, but in the process, you then become sort of the product that gets victimized by this.
And the bureaucracy always grows.
For sure. Right, absolutely. And one of the iconic studies of that was actually from Britain. They were looking at, as colonies gained independence, and then the budgetary needs of the Commonwealth and whatever it was, the agency that administered the colonies. And as the number of colonies reduced, the headcount actually grew. It's quite strange, because you think, well, you don't have as many colonies, perhaps you don't need as many staff anymore. But no, it was the contrary.
Yeah, look, I find it so frustrating, and especially when I look at taxation. When you look at taxation as a business owner, you create a business, and you employ people, and every month you pay a tax on those employees. You pay their income tax for them, which is their tax, but you have to pay a national insurance. So the company has to pay that. And at the end of the year, I have to then pay a corporation tax. And then from that, I pay myself either a dividend or wages, but they've closed the loophole on dividends v wages. So essentially, I still pay the same tax. And with that money I get, I then buy things where I pay a tax on them, whether that is fuel tax, whether it's VAT on products. It's a continual rent seeking all the hard work that I and the team I have done. And I mean, I don't know how much I end up giving to the government, but I feel like in the end, it's 70% maybe.
Yeah.
It may be higher.
Yeah.
And the most frustrating thing about this, I'm not anti-tax. I think there are things that governments can do and will help. I'm not anti-tax. But what became really obvious is that this podcast we do over the last 5 years, over the last year is where we hit the, really did start to do well. We had a good amount of income coming in. Because that income had come in and I had that in my pocket, I could buy this bar. It became available. And, maybe in a year I can then open another bar because I have the capital, which means I can then employ people and create jobs, and pay people. And so this, it became more evident when I got free, when I became free from the economic constraints because of the success of the business, it became more evident about where I could put that money to good work. And so, I'm not anti-tax, I'm not completely anti-government, but I am anti the size of the bureaucracy and what it's become.
Right.
And all I care about now is how do we shrink that? It's almost why I've become very sympathetic with the libertarians. I used to think of the libertarians as naive and, your system will never work. What are you on about? It's never going to work. My sympathy now is that all I care about is shrinking government, shrinking power, shrinking control, shrinking tax, because I know if you remove these bureaucratic layers and you reduce tax, more people will start businesses and that will lead to more productivity. It's so obvious now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We were talking earlier about Taiwan. The university I was teaching at was right next to a big night market called Onge Night Market in Taichung, one of the biggest in Taiwan. And the way it worked there was a certain amount of mafia involvement in the governance. So they would do things like quality control, make sure that you wash your dishes. But because it was a private sector enforcer, it was a very light touch. And essentially, if you wanted to run a business, you would just go. They had little places where you would rent the little truck on wheels, the little kitchen on wheels. So you would go down there, you would rent that. You would pay $100 for a guy to do novel signage for you. So you would decide what to name your business and whatnot. You would wheel that over to the market and you would set up shop, and then you would pay a little bit of rent, and that was it, right? There were no licenses, there was nothing. There was this private sector quality control to make sure that you weren't doing anything crazy. But the end result was that you had thousands and thousands of people who had these little businesses there. You did not have to be almost maniacally driven in order to actually start a business, which, today in a place like Britain or the US, if you don't already have like a family business that you're taking over, like if you are out of the blue deciding to start manufacturing something in Britain, you've got to, there's got to be some special reason you're doing that. Like, maybe because it's inherent to the brand, you've got the flag on it or something. But if you're going to manufacture something normal, pens in Britain, you've got to have a screw loose because it is so difficult to do. And, nobody wants that. No matter how you vote, nobody on earth hates small business and wants pen factories to be destroyed in their country. That's just an insane preference. But the problem is that once you give all of this power to whatever you call it, the government machinery, it starts doing perverse things. It does things that are in its interests and not necessarily in yours. Now, in theory, the voters could then look at that and they could say, hey, this is terrible. Look how hard it is to start a business. And so they could call, they would communicate to their politicians. Their politicians would tell the bureaucrats to stop doing that. And I think that it used to do that. Like if we go back to that Victorian or the Golden Age, I think that government was small enough that there were transmission mechanisms. So if you had, the local MP would hear the fish and chip shops in their neighborhood would be upset about something, and then they would talk, and then it would get resolved really quickly. But today, of course, there are these massive layers of bureaucracy. Everything has got to go through. I can't imagine how many layers of bureaucratic approval something has to go through. And the bureaucrats don't even have to necessarily listen to you. They have their own goals in life. Maybe there's some program that has a lot of budget potential in the future, and so it's going to be very good for their bureaucratic career. And so they're not particularly interested in what the fish and chip shops needs. This is what I personally need in order to progress the bureaucracy. You get all these perverse incentives, and the system. One expression, this is from Mencius Moldbug, is a self-licking ice cream cone. Like the system exists to serve itself. It is no longer serving us, the people. And the problem, of course, is that we have to obey that system, right? Like that system is our sovereign.
There's no opt-out.
Right. But in theory, of course, we the people are the sovereign. So something is very wrong in this picture here, right? We have this ruling Leviathan that has very, very little input from us. It ignores politicians, for fun. And I mean, I don't have that much respect for politicians, but compared to a ruling Leviathan that does not even care what the people think, I will take politicians any day of the week who are at least somewhat responsive. So it starts to look like an occupying army.
Yeah. And I a lot of the times I question, what should the role of government be? What do we need government for? Is there fair regulations? When I went up to Wyoming, I met a chap called Tyler up there, and he was saying to me, they were trying to get rid of licenses. He said when he took over, if you were hairdressers, you needed the license to be a hairdresser. He said you shouldn't need a license to be a hairdresser. Right. You should just open and cut people's hair.
Yeah,
that should be it.
Right.
But at the same time, I would contrast. That was quite a contrast. But I went to an Ai Weiwei exhibition, and one of his displays was from the earthquake in China. There was a certain region where lots of properties collapsed, and the reason they were collapsed because they were badly built.
Right.
They didn't follow regulations, and so when the earthquake hit, these buildings collapsed. So he took the metal steel structures and built sculptures out of them, and that also flipped to me to make me realize that actually, some of these regulations around buildings are designed to protect people. We had a huge fire in the UK called Grenfell. It was a block of flats that went up in fire. I think about 85 people died. Right. Again, because the cladding they used around the building wasn't great. So sometimes I think, well, should we, and I know there's people out there who argue, no, the free market will always solve these problems. I'm not 100% sure. I often come down to if there are certain mistakes made, it would lead to considerable death. Maybe that is something that needs regulation. Is there any room for that in a world of sound muddy and Austrian economics?
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to that Victorian/Golden Age, there was some regulation. There was much, much less than there is today. And overwhelmingly, the way that problems like that, basically corporate misbehavior or individual misbehavior, the way that those were dealt with was through the common law system of tort. So if somebody endangered you, then you could bring a lawsuit. Lawsuits were extraordinarily easy to bring. Typically, you would not have to hire a lawyer. You would not have to go through that expense. You would simply go to the magistrate and you would say, hey, this person did this. And the magistrate would send his bailiff around to ask the other person, come and tell your side of the story, and then he would make a decision. It was poof. It was very, very easy. And so you had that tort system worked fantastically. And the goal was that if somebody harmed you, if they were negligent, then they had to compensate you for the harm. And logically, the reason that you're building it that way is that you're saying, so if my business burns down your house, the most economically efficient way to treat that is as if the business burned down his own house. Okay, you want to internalize the costs of any kind of risk into the business itself, and that's what the tort system does. And so if tort is functioning, you need government to enforce it, right? So in that scenario, if the magistrate goes to the other guy and he says, well, I've decided that you've done something reckless. Let's say you set a fire in your backyard and you ended up burning down the neighbor's house, so you have to pay them. Well, somebody has to force that other person to actually pay what they owe, right? So I think that, there are ways to do that in in an anarchic system where you have, basically individuals self-organize and then they will choose like a village elder and things like that. It's hard to get there from here.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where countries like China exist, who, guarantee if you have a sovereign island that has no police force out in the Pacific, somebody's taking that island. In fact, that actually happened. There was, I think it was in the 1970s, there were a group of hippies who founded the Republic of, God, what was it called? Anyway, Nirvana or something. And literally the neighboring country, I think it was Tuvalu, came by with like 4 soldiers in a boat with a flag. And they showed up. It's like, do you have a flag? So they showed up and they had the guns and they brandished the guns and they put the flag on. They said, thank you, this is our territory. Okay, so, there are very practical reasons why you can't quite get from where we are now to anarcho-capitalist. But I think that, when we ask about alternatives to regulation, fortunately we have that golden age and we can look at how things were resolved back then. You had very, very small number of regulations. The ones that existed were generally corrupt, such as Bank of England, or we didn't have the Fed quite yet, but you did have some corrupt regulations. It was a much, much smaller number. And for the rest of the world, the sort of free market world, you had tort. And yes, government had to enforce tort in that kind of scenario, but I think we can get there, again, if we look at places like Taiwan, for example, there's a certain magic to simply shrinking the government down to a certain level. The government starts to say there are certain things that it cannot enforce. So I grew up in Philadelphia and in the 70s, and Philadelphia was kind of a rough town, it still is. And there were certain things that the police did not notice. A lot of business violations that they didn't notice. And why? Well, because their mom went to church with, the deli guy's mom, right? There were like social connections, why people didn't, play the whole thing bureaucratically. And there were also budget issues. So the police were fairly responsive and they wanted to put guys on murders and they didn't want to put them on, is your deli serving beer without a license. That was not considered to be a serious issue. So I think that we can get back to that without necessarily like crushing the whole system and rebuilding on the ashes, rather that simply, A, restricting budgets, B, cutting the power of the bureaucracy so that, we should not have a civil service that is independent of the people. It should be extraordinarily easy to fire anybody in the government. That would actually fix it in one single go. If the prime minister could waltz in and fire everybody in the British hierarchy, you would have a complete cultural transformation where the entire British government would now work for the politicians. Politicians suck, but they are a lot better than a permanent civil service that is completely independent of the people.
Well, I had this conversation with my son recently because I have a growing interest of running for mayor of Bedford.
Yes.
Yes. Seeing what I've seen, talking to people like you and understanding these problems and knowing my council's budget and seeing where they've spent it. And we're by far not the worst, but I said to my son, I think the first thing I'm going to do is really piss a lot of people off because I'm going to just go in and get rid of as many people as I can doing wasteful jobs. Now, that is actually very difficult. It's very difficult to get rid of people in the UK.
Yeah.
Which is obviously ludicrous.
Yeah.
Because you want people to be able to learn from being got rid of.
Right.
It's sports. You learn by winning and losing.
Well, and the mayor is the representative of the people. The people are sovereign.
Yes. And so I imagine in my little dream fantasy of being mayor of Bedford, I would walk in first day and I would just go around and find out what everybody does. And then I would go away and I'd come back and say, well, I'm getting rid of this department and this department and this department. We're getting rid of this. We're going to change this. I know it's not going to happen because there will be power structures and walls that stop me doing that.
Absolutely.
But that's what I want to do, and I want to do it. My son rightly said, he said, you won't be able to do that. You won't be able to, but I want to have a go.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of thing could inspire movements across the country.
Of course.
You see what's happening now with the 15-minute cities and the civil disobedience. I think the people of Britain and the people of the US are ripe for that kind of movement that puts more power into the hands of the people.